Welcome to the first episode in a Legendarium series about medieval outlaws. This episode is about Hereward the Wake. We'll be talking about how this famous Anglo-Saxon rebel was actually descended from the Danes. We'll talk about his early career as an outlaw and mercenary, and how he came to lead Anglo-Saxon resistance in the southeast after the Norman Conquest. While Hereward expected help from the Danes, they abandoned him and left him to face King William's counterattack on his own. Those familiar with Robin Hood in the 19th and 20th century versions know that the heroic outlaw was reinvented not just as a noble outlaw who robbed the rich and gave to the poor, but a national hero who fought to reverse the Norman Conquest of 1066. He didn't just rob, he fought against evil overlords from Normandy who were oppressing Anglo-Saxon peasants, a theme that runs through the books of Sir Walter Scott in the 1800s to the 1938 film starring Errol Flynn. And there is one real-life outlaw who strongly resembles this Victorian hero. His name was Hereward the Wake. Of course, there's one big difference between this possible real-life Robin Hood and what we see on the big screen. He wasn't English. Popular lore claimed that Hereward was the son of an Anglo-Saxon nobleman named Earl Lofric. This nobleman, so the story went, taxed his subjects so much that they were reduced to poverty. When his wife, Lady Godiva, begged Earl Lofric to lower taxes, he answered that she would have to ride unclothed through the streets of Coventry before he did such a thing. However, she did indeed take off her clothes and ride through the streets. This moved her husband to tears, and then he lowered taxes. A wonderful story, but probably just that. In fact, Hereward was the son of an Anglo-Danish magnate named Askedal. So what were Danes doing in Anglo-Saxon England, and why were they running the place? For a time in the 1000s, the whole of England became part of a huge Danish empire, which included Norway and southern Sweden. It was ruled first by Sweyn Forkbeard, and then his son King Canute. While the Scandinavian kings of England died out and the Anglo-Saxons got the throne back, a great many Danish warriors who earned land and title in England stayed there, choosing to make peace with the new Anglo-Saxon king Edward the Confessor rather than abandon their family legacy. Among these Danish overlords who bent the knee to the Anglo-Saxon king was Askedal, who had a son named Hereward. Now, I wish I could tell you that Hereward was a dutiful son to Askedal, but he wasn't. In fact, around the year 1060, when Hereward was just 14 or 15 years old, Hereward's own father, Askedal, petitioned the king to have his son declared an outlaw. King Edward the Confessor agreed. Now, you have to keep in mind that during the Anglo-Saxon era, people who were declared an outlaw became a wolf's head. That meant any man could kill Hereward for any reason and face no legal penalty at all. So it's not surprising that Hereward left home. This time of his life spent abroad was later filled by storytellers with grand adventures, like single-handedly killing a bear and saving a princess from an unwanted marriage. However, he likely went to Europe, where he worked for a series of Flemish magnates and eventually became the commander of mercenaries for Count Baldwin of Flanders. During Hereward's exile, England, one of the best-governed states in medieval Europe, whose silver penny was used across the continent, was invaded and conquered by Duke William of Normandy in 1066. Duke William remade the country from top to bottom, beginning with the aristocracy. Anglo-Saxon and Danish lords, some of whom had held land and title since the original Anglo-Saxon invasions of the 400s, were dispossessed and had a choice between poverty or exile. Many chose exile. Some went as far east as Constantinople, where Anglo-Saxon Huscarls came to make up most of the East Roman Emperor's personal guard, the Varangians. However, others chose to stay and fight. Anglo-Saxon rebels set up ambushes for Norman invaders in the woods and other remote places. Other Normans died in the streets during casual knifings. It wasn't long before Norman abbots and nobles went nowhere unless accompanied by parties of knights. King William the Conqueror imposed a new law called the murdrum fine. Whenever a man was found murdered, the surrounding villages had to provide evidence that the dead man was English. If not, the dead man was assumed to be French, and all of the nearby villages had to pay a heavy fine. Not surprisingly, it wasn't long before Hereward's family in England got into trouble with the new overlords. Hereward first returned to England as a soldier in an army sent by King Sweyn of Denmark to the Isle of Ely. However, the Danes were soon defeated by the Normans and went home, but Hereward stayed home to see what became of his family. And according to local lore, he learned that his family's lands had been seized and given over to a Norman knight named Ivo de Talabluy, and his father and brother murdered. The severed head of Hereward's brother was placed on a spike at the entrance of his family's house, while the Normans inside gorged themselves at a drunken feast. Hereward put his father's house in order by jumping from the shadows and killing 14 of the Norman knights. Hereward then buried his brother as best he could and placed 14 Norman heads on spikes outside his family's house, a warning of things to come. Hereward's legend grew, and Anglo-Saxon rebels, including former earls, flocked to join Hereward's guerrilla war against the Normans. Hereward and his men retreated to a watery wasteland studded with small islands called the Fens, a perfect hiding place for the rebels. It had been used by rebels first against the Mercian invasions of the 600s, the Viking invasions of the 800s, and now the Norman invasion of the 1000s. Hereward used Peterborough Abbey as headquarters, a task that was made much easier because the abbot, Brand, was his uncle. The local peasants helped Hereward and his men navigate the treacherous marshes of the Fens. Norman knights, abbots, and tax collectors soon began to vanish, and then turned up days later as nothing but heads mounted on stakes along the roadside. Not surprisingly, King William was not amused. He sent a force to the rebel-held Isle of Ely, where they built a huge wooden bridge. Hereward lined up his men on the other side of the causeway, careful to stay off the rickety bridge. And in their rush to get at both the rebels and the treasure of Peterborough Abbey, the Norman knights caused the bridge to collapse as they engaged Hereward and his Anglo-Saxon rebels. Weighed down by their heavy mail coats, they sank straight to the bottom of the Fens. A century later, skeletons wearing rotten armor coats were still being pulled out of the water. Not long afterwards, Hereward was knighted by his uncle Abbot Brand. His list of successes growing, Hereward enlisted more support from Denmark, the homeland of his ancestors. In 1069, the Danish royal family and church sent a couple of longships across the North Sea to assist Hereward. Hereward believed that these Danish ships were merely the vanguard of a larger Danish invasion that would sweep England clean of the Normans. Hereward's main priority at the time was protecting the treasures of Peterborough Abbey from the Normans. The Danes reportedly offered to help him with this, and they did indeed protect the treasures of Peterborough Abbey very safely in their ships all the way back home to Denmark, leaving Hereward to face the Normans alone. And King William the Conqueror was not in a good mood after this latest debacle. In 1071, King William the Conqueror himself went to the Fens and launched a determined assault on the Isle of Ely, this time using siege equipment. However, King William also summoned the supernatural. While King William built his catapults around Ely, he had a witch climb a raised wooden platform where the rebels would see her. She ranted at the isle, promising destruction and defeat. And after each incantation, the witch flashed her bare backside and blew a blast of flatulence at the rebels on Ely. In time, Hereward led a small band across the river, which burned the witch's tower. She broke her neck after trying to jump to safety. Now, while Hereward's exploits made him popular among the Anglo-Saxon nobles who lost their land to the Normans, the peasants were more worried about getting the harvest in, and this rebellion was making that job harder. So some of the English peasants guided King William's men towards a secret route to Ely. The Norman knights overwhelmed and crushed Hereward's men. We have no idea what happened to Hereward himself. He probably either died on Ely with his men or went into exile and was never heard from again. Yet, Hereward's legend became so great that by the 1400s, one noble family called the Wakes even claimed descent from the Anglo-Saxon rebel who tried to drive their ancestors from England. Centuries after his death, medieval tourists went to a wooden palisade in the Fens called Hereward's Castle, and even in the modern age, his life was the subject of books and films, and he may have helped to inspire a tale about a certain bandit hero. And that wraps things up for this episode of The Legendarium. I hope you enjoyed it. If you like what you saw, press like. If you want to see more, press subscribe. And if you've got anything to say, let me know in the comments section. Thanks again for joining me, and I hope that you have a great rest of the day.